Welcome to the Kepler Conference Online Research Forums. I'm Courtney Roberts, and we've got a really special program today heading into the next Kepler conference. We're very blessed to have such an excellent speaker in Demetra George today, and we're going to be discussing some fascinating and controversial things. The program is called Astrology, History versus Historiography. And I'm going to kick it off with a little introduction. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to go to my screen share real quick. And I just want to remind everybody that the Kepler conference is coming up really soon. January 24th through 27th, we have a great lineup of speakers and an even more impressive lineup of topics and research projects and results. It's 4 days, and each day has a theme, so to speak. The first day is Intro to Research Astrology, which is a good, grounding and introduction for everybody to get into the flow of the thing. The second day, Friday, is more evidence-based and quantitative research projects. And then the Saturday is research in Vedic and Indian astrology. And we also finish that day off with some research in medical astrology. Will Morris will be presenting on that, and you don't want to miss that. And a little bit of research in mundane astrology. And then Sunday, this workshop today is kind of the kickoff for Sunday, because we're expanding the Kepler Conference to include more qualitative research projects, as well as historical research. And that's the theme on the Sunday. And we've got some really good projects there. Now, there's 3 ways you can attend. You can come in person for the whole conference, or for single day registrations. Those are all available. And you can also attend online. We will be live broadcasting, live streaming in this kind of a format so that people can participate, and we'll certainly do everything we can to keep our international online visitors engaged in the process, and of course they'll get the recordings as well. Again, we certainly hope that you'll all join us there for the Kepler conference, and that in a way this is kind of very, very special introduction or even kickoff to the whole process. So I'm going to go ahead and start my introduction to today's topic. Okay. So we're talking again about astrology, history versus historiography. And the whole idea is about presenting astrology in its best light. We want to look at some hot topics in the history of astrology, like the Star of Bethlehem and precession in the age of Pisces, and look at some of the myths and legends that are often circulated as facts or as truth that I think we all need to spend a lot more time, verifying and exploring. And I think we want to look at this whole idea of first history versus historiography, and what do we actually mean by that? And this is something that Nick Campion introduced me to back when I was studying at Bath Spa, and he's a pretty passionate historian, and the whole idea is that there's history and there's historiography. Historiography is the writing of history, the process of writing history. And the idea is that there's a difference. There's always a difference between history itself, objective history, whatever that is, and the writing of history, meaning that, everybody brings their own bias to their version of history. And history is a discipline. It's not something that most people are born ready to do. I think it takes a lot of training and a lot of self-control to do it properly, because the first thing that every amateur historian does when they look back at the past, people, cultures, events in the past, is they project themselves upon it. We all do that. It's very natural, but that's the first thing that any historian has to confront. And you really have to win that battle of getting yourself out of the way. And you never entirely do. But, you know, hopefully you get to a point where you're honest enough about your own biases that at least you can make progress in that direction. The problem is when people, you know, don't even recognize that that's a problem in the first place. And I think we have all kinds of examples, again, throughout astrology, in the way that people talk, again, about topics like the Star of Bethlehem, or the age of Aquarius, the age of Pisces, where they're passing things off as history. And you know, they need a lot more examination. And we're going to look into a lot of that today. But at the same time, in looking at these topics, I think it gives everybody a chance to try to put your own biases out on the table and to try to address maybe some of the assumptions that you're not even aware that you're carrying about. For instance, when we're looking at the Star of Bethlehem and when we're looking at things like the age of Aquarius, and somebody's got their mic on and it's coming through really loud, if you can make sure your mic's muted. You know, here in the West, we're in this kind of Western Judeo-Christian tradition. And even if you don't believe in it, the whole culture we're in is just steeped in it. And, you know, if you don't believe me, go try and teach English overseas to foreigners and find out how much of that you have to explain to them in the first place that we take for granted. I've had that experience for years, and it really threw it back in my face and made me aware of, you know, how much we're really steeped in that whole tradition. And what's ironic about it is that along with the Judeo-Christian tradition, we also consider ourselves the cultural heirs of the classical Greco-Roman civilization. And that's another fundamental basis for us. And the irony here for me is that those two civilizations, the Jews and the Greeks and the Romans, were bitter enemies. I mean, couldn't have been more diametrically opposed in all of their beliefs, and, you know, fought each other extensively. And yet somehow we're supposed to unite that within ourselves. And I think that actually creates a whole lot of problems for us that we don't talk about enough. So, you know, throughout my slides here, you're going to see a lot of these pictures of, you know, Moses as he probably never appeared, because I think, you know, we really need to confront that idea of how we're just always making history over in the image of ourselves. And you see that in art history all the time. They always paint people from the past as if, you know, like they never appeared, but because they're projecting themselves upon him. And I just can't make that point enough, that we're doing that all the time. And this is the opportunity to put it out on the table. Now, we do have an order of the day, so to speak, and I'm doing the introduction part right now, history versus historiography. Demetra's coming on after me in just a moment, and she's going to talk about researching history, the importance of primary sources, languages, etc. It's extremely important, and especially for astrologers, because unfortunately a lot of the histories that astrologers put out, they skip all of that part. I mean, they're pretty egregious about it. And Demetra's laughing about it, because I'm so glad that she's got my back on this point, because it couldn't be more important. You know, we really want to put our best foot forward. We want to put astrology in the best possible light, because, you know, let's face it, we don't get a whole lot of respect out there. And I think that we need to take more responsibility for how people see us. And, you know, when we have, you know, people in leadership roles in astrology organizations getting up and talking about the history of astrology, and it's like fantasy. There's no reference to sources, because they don't really have sources. You know, we can do better than that. We're going to have to do better than that. And Demetra's got a game plan. So I'm really excited about that part. Then after she does that, I'm going to be talking about the Star of the Magi, and particularly looking at three questions there. Who were the Magi? Why did the authors and editors of Matthew use them to make their case for Jesus Christ? And what kind of astrology did the Magi practice? Notice, and nowhere in there am I asking the question, what was the Star of Bethlehem? Okay, I just don't think that's a relevant question. And we'll get into more of that. When you ask questions like this, you actually get much better answers, I think. So once I go through the bulk of that, then Demetra's going to talk about notable nativities and the ways that people in the world looked to an astrology chart to try to determine if somebody would be a king, a leader, etc. Then we're going to finish up with more of an open discussion on the whole idea of Pisces, precession, and the New Age. Another, historical model that astrologers, put out there very freely, but that I think needs a lot more work. Again, I studied under Nick Campion, who's made a career out of dismissing the whole Age of Aquarius thing. And again, I think we need to have some very serious discussions about the kinds of beliefs that people are just freely throwing around out there. So without any further ado, here's a chance to get really up close and personal with all of our biases, our astrological biases, our cultural biases, our Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Hellenistic biases, and let's really try to put this stuff out on the table and get real with it. So I'm going to turn it over now to Demetra, and I just want to say again how fortunate we are to have a speaker of this caliber. Demetra's highly qualified. She's taught the history of astrology both at Kepler College, but also at the University of Oregon as part of their classics department. And when you teach at that level, you have to have discipline. You have to be referring to sources and references, and she does that to the highest level. And of course, we also want to remind you that her latest book has just come out this week on ancient astrology, and we're all very excited about that. So Demetra, without any further ado, take it away. Demetra, you good? Good. Okay.
Good. Success. Okay. Thank you, Courtney, for inviting me to do this talk with you today. And it's really part of getting ready for the Kepler conference. When I was there 2 years ago, I felt it was one of the most exciting conferences I'd been to in a very long time, maybe even ever. And I had that excitement that you do as a new astrologer, going and opening up the breathtaking work that's being done now in the research field. So I'm greatly looking forward to returning and being able to participate on a small level, and totally thanking Courtney for the tremendous work that she's doing in bringing this aspect of our current practice forward and making it available. Okay, so what I'm going to spend maybe the next 10 or 12 minutes overviewing is just some basic principles in how to research the history of astrology that with Courtney's larger objective of to elevate the status of astrology, one of the best ways to do that is by doing good astrology. And in particular, when we look to the history of astrology, how do we research our own tradition and present it in such a way that it is credible to the larger contemporary audience, to the extent that many astrologers, and certainly myself included when I started out, I knew that we had a long tradition for thousands of years, but what exactly it was and who was involved and what kinds of things had happened was a complete blur and mystery. And to the extent that the astrologers as a community don't educate themselves in our historical tradition, then they are much more likely spreading platitudes and opinions and misperceptions about our past, that for people who are more versed in science and academia look at that and they go, this is ridiculous. And with that, astrology is once again dismissed. So that there is an agenda for each of us that are talking about our tradition to know certain techniques and procedures that allow us to do a credible job with that. And one of the things I'm trying to bring to the Kepler Conference is the notion that the research into the history is as important as the quantitative and qualitative evidence-based research that's being done now. And it's all three of these branches collectively that can have the function of elevating astrology's perception in the larger world. Okay, so Courtney, here's the first thing. Okay, great, I got it to click. Okay, and I want to start out by making the point that what I'm going to be talking about today includes this approach into the history, origins, translations, and transmission of techniques. And what is often called historical mundane astrology in our community is related but different. And this is where we look back into history in order to correlate certain planetary patterns and geopolitical events. And so these are related fields, but they have different approaches. And what I'm going to be working on is talking a little bit about is the first one. Okay, so I'm not going to do all of these slides because for this audience today, you have the sense of the general format of a research paper is actually quite similar to the general format of both the quantitative and qualitative papers, with the title, abstract, introduction, literature review, showing that you have some familiarity with your area, the methods that you use, your data and sources, your results and your conclusions and bibliography. So it may be depending on the level of the audience on the research day, I may spend more time on this, but for now, we're breezing through that. And then what I want to point out is that there are a number of different kinds of research projects into the history of astrology that includes astrology itself, but also how astrology in the ancient world, how astrology interfaced with religion, with philosophy, and with politics. It is such a huge, rich field of discovering how influential, if not technical astrology itself, the background ideas of astrology in shaping astral religions and contributing to vibrant debates that were going on between philosophers, and certainly influencing the actions of rulers, many of whom were using their court astrologers for going back to Babylonia through to the Byzantine Empire for at least 3,000 years. Astrologers had critical roles in the shaping of rulers' actions and dynasties. Then there's a whole field of textual translation, that there are hundreds, thousands of astrological texts written in many different languages beyond our own English. And this is an important piece of the work that's being done now, of translating them into the language that we speak and providing commentary so we can see what it was that the ancient astrologers themselves thought about their practice and how it was that they conducted it, and then to be able to see what pieces of the early tradition has survived and remained, which have been lost and dropped out, and which pieces have been added and when, based on time and culture. But we can't gain those insights unless we actually have the source material itself. Then there's the field of the explication of an ancient doctrine or technique. I'm thinking about something that showed up in our translation of the Hellenistic text called spear bearers. And spear bearers, from a technical point of view, was a set of different factors that indicated that a person had a destiny that he or she would be eminent. And in ancient times, spear bearers, they're like the current Secret Service bodyguards. They would accompany important people in front and behind, protecting them. And if an individual had these protective bodyguards, then they must be really important. And so this is something that's been quite lost and is like one of dozens and dozens of ancient techniques that can have relevance for our contemporary times. Then we have the origins and transmissions of individual astrological principles and techniques. And finally, the biography of historical people who, not some of whom may have been astrologers, but others whose lives had a huge impact on the development of astrology during their era. So this is the overview of some of the directions that a historical approach can focus on. Now, what's essential in order to do this work is to have a broad understanding of history, and particularly the eras and geographical places where astrology or celestial divination was practiced. And then beyond that, what were the languages that astrology was written in? So some of our broad areas are the Babylonian astrology that really included the Sumerian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, and the Persian to a certain extent. Actually, all of the first three were written in Akkadian and had a time span between 2000 and BCE and 0 BCE. So this is a 2,000-year period of many, many texts written in cuneiform tablets in the Akkadian language, only a fraction of which have been currently translated, but would have opened us up to many concepts, the importance of planets rising and setting heliacally and culminating at the midheaven. The planetary years were discovered during that period, and really the cycles and orbits of all of the planets. Then you have Indian and Hindu astrology that is written in Sanskrit, in Urdu, and in Hindi, and that has a 4,000-year period of texts that are available to be translated in mind. There are a number of Egyptian astrology that is written in both hieroglyphic and demotic. Demotic is the Egyptian language transliterated to Greek words and script. The Hellenistic astrology, which is where currently many people in the field are focusing on. This was a period between 150 BC and about 700 CE. It was composed by astrologers from Syria, from Asia Minor, from Egypt, from North Africa, as well as in the Roman Empire, and written in Greek, Latin, and Syriac, which were the common languages of the day. But the point with Hellenistic is it wasn't the Greeks, it was people from all over the Mediterranean basin who were contributing to this. Then you have Persian astrology, and Persia is another name for Iran that sometimes is connected with Mesopotamia and Babylonia, and sometimes is set to the side as a unique culture. And certainly it has a different ethnic group than the Semitic that's in the rest of Babylonia. And this was written in Pahlavi and in Farsi. And these texts from these two languages we have evidence of these texts from 200 CE to about 1500 CE. There undoubtedly were earlier texts, but we don't currently have access or evidence to some of the Persian material that was happening during the from the Seleucid period through Alexander the Great's reign into the beginnings of Alexandria when the Parthians came on. Then we have the whole heyday of Arabic astrology that's written in Arabic from 700 to 1300 CE. There are hundreds and hundreds of texts, not only translations of the Greek, but also new material that was composed by people writing in Arabic. And some of that is an amalgamation of the Hellenistic along with the Hindu astrology that came from India. Then when we move to the east, this areas I'm not so familiar with, but we have Tibetan astrology that happened from 700 CE to the present. The Tibetan astrology was by and large a merger of the Indian Hindu Vedic astrology with the Chinese astrology. And then China and Japan have had their own traditions. China, real early on, we know that Ptolemy made his way to China, as did Dorotheus. And there was a whole sequence of medieval Japanese astrology that's now being brought to light by Japanese astrologers. Then this Hellenistic that got translated into Arabic that incorporated Indian Vedic by the 1200s became translated into Latin and Hebrew. And there are many Latin texts that are now being translated, many of those by Ben Dykes, and Ben is also doing Arabic translations. And then as the Renaissance went on, the Latin became translated, or the writers wrote in Spanish, French, German, and English. And then we have modern astrology in multiple places and languages. Now, what's important about all of this from a research point of view is each time a text is translated from one language to another, the translator has to make choices about what word they're going to use for an important concept. And their choice of words can greatly impact how that doctrine is now understood going forward. And in my main talk at the conference, I want to show you how that happened with the fifth house. But what this reminds me of is when I first, my second year in Latin, we were reading Virgil. And we got to the place where Virgil goes to the cave of the Sibyl, and he's about to go into the underworld to connect with his father. And when he encounters the Sibyl, who is an ancient prophetess, there was an adjective describing her called horrendi. And when I looked up horrendi in the dictionary, I saw, oh, well, there are 4 meanings I could choose from. One was horrible, one was monstrous, one was awesome, and the 4th one was most holy. And so am I going to call this the most holy Sibyl, or am I going to call this the monstrous Sibyl? And in that, I had like my first just bombshell exploding in my mind of how translators can completely change the meanings of original texts. And at a certain point, you don't really know what the text says until you could read it in its own language. And that's, I'm sorry, you keep losing me on the screen because my Gemini moon, I can't sit still and talk at the same time. So this may not be possible for all of you doing history, but what we can do is if a text has been translated into by more than one translator, to gather the different translators and to check critical words and to see how they have been reinterpreted and be able to bring that insight into our discussion. Okay, and here on this page, now we can make this available later on, just a few sources for studying more on the history of astrology. Chris Brennan's book on Hellenistic astrology, Nick Campion's 2 volumes on the history of Western astrology, James Holden, his history of horoscopic astrology, and Holden and Brisky's biographical dictionary of Western astrologers, which is about this fat, okay, have tremendous information that can be accessed to help give you sources, which we're going to get to next. So your sources for research are primary sources and secondary sources. Your primary sources are things that allow you to have a firsthand account or as close to the time period as possible that you are studying. Now, when Courtney talks about history and historiography, we will never know exactly what happened. And to a large extent, we have to rely on the writing of history by others who have their biases in recounting the events. If you can imagine, 500 years from now, if the only accounts we have of our contemporary time period is one person's Twitter account, that might in fact be not a totally accurate record, but nevertheless, it's as close to the actual time as we can access. And that's what becomes really important in the carefulness of the scholarly research. And those firsthand accounts can be documents, images, artifacts created or experienced contemporaneously with the event being researched. We want to understand it and investigate it as it was communicated by the original author or understood by others within its own time period. And this is really important. What did the ancients think themselves about the kind of astrology that they were doing, separate from our projections looking back on it 2,000 years later, to understand something in its own terms? Secondary sources are works that interpret or analyze a historical event or period after it's occurred, and a research paper will cite both primary and secondary sources as part of the reference material. Now, we have material evidence, which is like actually things that we can look at. The cuneiform horoscopes, the clay tablets that have been inscribed. We also have papyrus that contains fragments of horoscopes on them. There were these huge dumps of papyrus horoscopes found in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt and in other places. And it was just like someone like throwing out all their paper for recycling to pick up, and then it being buried, and thousands of years later it's excavated, and oh my goodness, look at what we have. And there's all kinds of work going on now in the academic fields of the putting back together the clay tablets and also scanning the papyrus fragments of horoscopes to understand the kind of astrology that was being done. You also saw horoscopes and astrological inscriptions on ostraca, which are pottery shards. And then one also has to look to artistic depictions and sculpture, paintings, gemstones, monuments, ceilings of temples, coffin lids, and churches. Then, along with the material evidence, we also have textual evidence, manuscripts of the texts themselves, critical editions of astrological texts. So a classical scholar will gather together 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 manuscripts that are all writing about the same text or book, but that have variations. And he or she will take the one that seems clearest, the best language, the most complete, and use that as a basis. And then after each phrase, to the extent that the other texts have differences, in the footnotes, be able to say text A, this is the variant, text B, that's the variant. And then that way, we're able to look at a main text and to see the variance in its tradition and transmission. We have the writings of the ancient astrologers in the original language and in translation. We have summaries by later authors. We have testimonia by other people of the time period that we have under investigation of saying, oh, so-and-so said this. And then we have the writings of historians, philosophers, scientists, and poets of the historical period. And all of these sources can be mined to gain a greater and more complete understanding of the topic we're trying to clarify. That brings us to the sources themselves and the discipline of being clear of who said what, when was it said, and where was it said. And this has to do with documenting your sources, so that if you make a statement and someone else looks at it and they go, whoa, like, where is this coming from? This is hard to believe. If you have your source, they can go back and look that up. And especially if it's a primary source, they can say, oh, this ancient person really did say that. Here it is. So you want to allow your reader to verify your claims through being complete in giving your sources. And then there's the question for how credible is your source? Just because some ancient person said it doesn't exactly mean it's true. And what was the reputation of that person in his or her own time period? I remember when I was in graduate school and I found this great quote by some classical author that I brought to my advisor, and I said, see, like he said this, and this was so. And my advisor looked at me and he said, oh, everyone knows he was such a liar. So it's like, oh. So you also need to have that sense of how knowledgeable and what kind of reputation your source had before you state your whole argument and position on that. Now, if you're doing listening to someone else's material and they make a statement, you want to ask them about that source and then check it for yourself to ensure that it is the correct citation and that what was really said. And I remember having that experience of going through in secondary sources, of seeing something that just seemed so strange to me. I followed their footnote to the so-called primary source, and I read that and I said, this is not what he said at all. Like, where did this person come off quoting his? This is not in the text. So it requires that kind of diligence to track your sources, and that it may be time-staking and it may be difficult, and you have to order books from interlibrary loan and wait for weeks for them to arrive. But this is the kind of work of the scholarly approach. And in that, you want to ascertain that what was said was not taken out of context or wasn't accurate. So here, and I'm not going to go through here of citing your sources. There are many different formats for how you create your footnotes and your bibliography entries, and that's beyond the scope of this talk. But I just want to finish this with an example of a history of astrology research paper that Jose Luis Belmonte had submitted to the AFA journal last year on Enki, the Sumerian god of Aquarius. And in his abstract, which every research paper should have, he said that the purpose of this was to examine the attributes, characteristics, images of the Sumerian god Enki to see if there are any similarities with Uranus, or Uranus as he was known to the Greeks. And then he wanted to explore the constellations of the Babylonians associated with Enki to see if they have anything to do with Aquarius, and then explore the origins of the Greek god Uranus, and the transmissions of Enki via Syria or via Phoenicia to Greece. So one important insight of this study, though it's not mentioned by the author, is addressing the contemporary debate concerning the legitimacy of modern versus ancient rulerships of zodiacal signs. Traditional astrology assigns Saturn as the ruler of Aquarius for around 2,000 years, and then Uranus became a modern ruler since its discovery in 1787. And can a case be made for Uranus's historical connection with the zodiacal sign Aquarius? And this was like not stated, but was an implication of the work that Belmonte did. But the sources that he used was one, the Mul-Apen, which is cuneiform tablets, which were compilations of astronomical knowledge from the first millennium BCE. He wrote the astrological reports to the Assyrian kings, again on cuneiform tablets from the 7th century BCE, where the kings had astrologers in the top of their ziggurat temples taking the omens every day, and runners running back to the capital giving their information to the king, and all of this is recorded. Artistic depictions of Enki from Babylonian art, Hesiod's theogony in Greek creation myth on Uranus, and Aratus's Phenomena, which was a Greek poem describing the constellations. So these were some of the ancient sources that he utilized in developing his explication of this process. And this is the kind of careful work in using primary sources that gives credence to the conclusions that you can arrive at in the presentation of your research in your paper. So with that, I'll close this session.
Thank you so much, Demetra. And if you want to stop the screen share, let's see
Yes.
if we've got any questions or any comments from the people in the room on that. And I'm sure when you compare the discipline of history that Demetra just laid out with the standard for publishing that passes in a lot of astrological literature, you can see there's a gap, you know, and the standard, the discipline, it leads to accuracy and certainly to credibility and respect. It's just incredibly important. So thank you so much for laying that out, Demetra.
Okay.
And they're saying thank you. And Renee is asking African Polynesian Inuit. I think she's referring to astronomical traditions, or let's say cultural astronomy, stellar religion. Sometimes it's a fine line whether we call it astrology or not. You know, there are categories. Yeah.
Right. I mean, when I was studying and teaching this, there was the awareness that many cultures worshipped the celestial bodies as deities. And we can call that an astral religion, where the gods are projected upon the stars, or the stars is seen as manifestations of the gods, and worshipped as such. And that is a characteristic of the astral religion. But as astrology is a method of divination, if those observations are not used as indications of future events that may happen to a culture or to an individual, or used as descriptors of the character of an individual based upon their appearance at a critical moment of birth, then that's not strictly astrology. Worship of the stars as deities is not enough to make a process astrology. It has to be used for some sort of divinatory function as it's applied to human character and events.
And again, it's a fine
Right.
line,
It's
but
a
that's why
it's
we
a
have
fine line.
terms like cultural astronomy, stellar
Right.
religion,
Yeah.
astral religion,
Yeah.
and those are all appropriate at different phases. And the fact of the matter is I don't know if there's many cultures on the face of the earth that didn't have some form of veneration of, what they saw in the nighttime sky. But
right. Yes, certainly, of course.
And that's why we need those distinctions.
Yes.
Any other questions or comments before we get on to the star of the Magi? Okay, very good. Then